welcome to the deep dive. Before we even get started today, just take a quick second to like and subscribe to the show so you never miss out on these explorations.
Right, definitely do that.
We have, well, it's a highly requested, incredibly intense topic on the table today, and I'd really want to hook you immediately with a direct, hard-hitting question right from the pages of today's source material.
Let's hear it.
Are you building a life, or are you financing someone else's?
Wow. Yeah, that's a weighty question to lead with, and I think it perfectly sets the analytical stage for the heavily documented material we're about to review.
It really does. So today's deep dive is an exclusive, ultra-long, and incisive review of a fascinating new ebook. It's titled Unconscionable Contract, Two-Tier Marriage Trap Misandry Under Gynocentrism by Conrad Riker.
It's quite a title, but it covers a lot of ground.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And listen, if you want to dive into the primary source yourself, you can buy this must-read book right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. We also strongly urge you to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack to keep up with his ongoing research.
Yeah, his Substack is very active. So, the overarching mission of our deep dive today is to really carefully unpack Riker's explosive breakdown of modern institutions.
Right.
We're going to be looking at the structural frameworks of marriage, family courts, the education system, and mainstream media. Riker presents a very detailed argument that these pillars of society have been fundamentally captured by feminist and gynocentric frameworks.
And from there, we'll explore his strategic playbook, which is specifically designed to navigate men's rights, financial autonomy, and just overall systemic survival.
Exactly. For men seeking what the author describes as the red pill truth about institutional histories before they were compromised, the book really frames itself as an absolute essential read.
It does. Now, before we jump into the actual mechanics of this text, we have a mandatory disclaimer that we have to put out there.
Very important.
The source material we are covering today contains highly politically charged viewpoints. We want to clearly inform you, the listener, that we are impartially reporting on the content provided. We are not taking sides, and we are not endorsing these viewpoints.
Right. Our role here is strictly to act as your objective guides. We're just trying to help you understand the really profound and controversial ideas contained in Riker's original work.
Precisely. Our objective is to synthesize the data, examine the anecdotes, and outline the historical context Riker presents. We are breaking down the architecture of his arguments, so you can critically examine the mechanics of his claims for yourself.
So where do we begin?
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with what Riker categorizes as the bait. He opens the book by examining how natural biological drives have, at least in his view, been weaponized against men.
Right, the evolutionary biology angle.
Yeah. To build this foundation, he relies really heavily on the foundational research of evolutionary psychologist David Buss. Let's look at how Riker utilizes Buss's data.
Well, David Buss's cross-cultural research is pretty essential to understanding Riker's whole premise here. The core biological concept he leans on is that women are evolutionarily hardwired for hypergamy.
And for anyone unfamiliar, hypergamy is detent.
It's the instinctual drive to seek a mate who offers higher status, greater resources, and physical protection. In our ancestral environment, selecting a high-status provider was purely a survival mechanism. It ensured better odds for your offspring.
Right, it was just practical.
Exactly. Riker's argument is that this ancient biological hardware hasn't just disappeared, it's simply running on modern software today. He argues that society actively masks this instinct, pretending we've evolved past it, while the instinct still completely dictates modern mating dynamics.
Let me pause you there, because this leads directly into a really fascinating concept Riker introduces called the provider paradox.
Ah, yes.
If we accept that hypergamy still drives selection, how does Riker reconcile the biological drive of men with modern societal expectations?
That is exactly where the paradox lies. Riker points out that men are evolutionarily driven by testosterone to build, to protect, and to compete for resources.
Which makes sense.
Right. Historically, these are the exact kinetic traits that built physical infrastructure and advanced civilization. However, Riker argues that modern society currently pathologizes these exact traits.
Labeling them as toxic masculinity.
Precisely. Labeling the drive to dominate and conquer as toxic masculinity. The paradox occurs because society simultaneously demands the financial and structural fruits of that exact labor. You're basically told your inherent nature is toxic, yet you're still expected to foot the bill.
He illustrates this with a pretty stark statistical contrast regarding workplace fatalities. Riker notes that 93% of all workplace fatalities are men.
93%?
Yeah, 93. We're talking about the loggers, the commercial fishermen operating out in the freezing Bering Sea, the construction workers building scaffolding 40 stories up. Riker uses this to argue against the mainstream narrative of systemic male privilege.
Let's just sit with that 93% statistic for a second. If you look at that purely through an economic and sociological lens, it highlights what Riker calls the empathy gap.
The empathy gap, right?
He argues that society obsesses over the myth of the wage gap, completely ignoring the reality of male physical sacrifice. When economists actually account for hours worked, the inherent danger of the profession, and overall career choice, Riker points out that the wage gap virtually disappears.
Yet, as he notes, there are no widespread protests or advocacy campaigns for the men being crushed in trenches or lost at sea.
No, society just accepts male disposability as a baseline feature of maintaining infrastructure.
Which really asks you, the listener, to reflect on the expectations placed upon you. Consider how often you might be expected to exhibit traditional masculine strength, whether that means working an 80-hour week, taking on physical risks, or serving as the primary financial pillar.
Only to see those exact traits shamed the moment they're no longer convenient for someone else?
Exactly. Riker frames this as a biological trap. You're compelled to provide and then culturally penalized for the mechanisms of your provision.
And if the biological trap is set at the cultural level, how does the actual extraction happen when a relationship breaks down? This transitions us perfectly into Riker's analysis of the legal system, which he refers to as the extraction phase.
He presents family courts not as halls of justice, but as kangaroo courts built on institutionalized misandry.
The data he presents in this section is incredibly heavy. He claims that 97% of alimony payers are men.
97%.
Yeah, and that mothers win primary physical custody in over 80% of cases.
So how exactly does Riker explain the legal mechanics allowing for this kind of statistical disparity?
What's fascinating here is how Riker deconstructs the legal framework. He argues that these statistics are not the result of men being inherently inferior parents. Rather, there's a systemic, unwritten presumption within family law that treats women as default caregivers and men as default financial utilities.
It's a wealth redistribution engine.
Exactly. He argues the court system operates essentially as that, a wealth redistribution engine. It treats the dissolution of a family like the liquidation of a corporate asset, where the man's future labor is the primary asset being liquidated.
He grounds this abstract theory with a very specific, detailed anecdote about a man named Mark. Mark is a structural engineer. According to the book, this is a man who designed complex bridges meant to withstand Category 5 hurricanes.
A builder.
A literal builder. Yet his life was structurally dismantled by the family court system. His ex-wife initiated a divorce, was awarded primary custody, secured 40% of Mark's future projected income, and then subsequently moved her yoga instructor into the very house Mark was legally obligated to continue paying for.
It is a visceral case study of what Riker terms legalized parasitism. He uses Mark's story to analyze the legal standard known as the best interests of the child.
Right, which sounds great on paper.
Sounds noble, right? But Riker argues that while this standard sounds noble, it has been entirely twisted in practice. Instead of safeguarding children's emotional well-being by ensuring equal access to both parents, it functions as a mechanism for state-sanctioned wealth transfer from the producers, the men, to the consumers, their ex-wives.
And Riker emphasizes that the emotional and financial tool of this mechanism is not accidental. He says it is a feature of the system. He details the tragic case of Robert Sand to illustrate the ultimate failure of this structure.
That was a tough section to read.
It really was. Sand was a father driven to suicide on the steps of an Illinois courthouse after being jailed repeatedly for falling behind on child support debts owed for children the court systematically prevented him from even seeing.
The Robert Sand case is presented as the absolute breaking point of male extraction. But Riker notes the legal trap doesn't just apply to divorce and custody. It extends into criminal law through frameworks like the Duluth model.
Let's examine that for a second. What exactly was the Duluth model originally intended to solve? And how does Riker argue it's currently weaponized in modern domestic disputes?
The Duluth model was developed in the 1980s as a framework for addressing domestic violence. It operates on a patriarchal theory of violence, meaning it inherently assumes that domestic violence is a tool used by men to control women.
So it starts with an assumption.
Right. And in practical application by law enforcement, Riker argues this translates into a mandate that police must arrest the male in a domestic dispute, regardless of the physical evidence at the scene. It basically operates on a presumption of male guilt.
Riker points out that this model completely ignores massive sets of sociological data showing that domestic violence is often mutual, or in many cases, female-initiated. He connects this systemic presumption of guilt to the weaponization of false accusations.
Exactly. He cites the high-profile Brian Banks case. Banks was a rising high school football star with a scholarship to USC. He lost 5 years of his life in prison and another 5 on parole due to a completely fabricated rape accusation.
And when his accuser finally admitted on hidden camera that she lied, she faced 0 legal consequences for perjury or the destruction of his life.
None. Riker uses the Banks case to argue that in a gynocentric legal system, an allegation against a man is legally treated with the weight of a conviction, while female perjury is systemically ignored.
So if the courts are the mechanism of extraction, Riker argues that the media and educational institutions are what manufacture consent for that extraction. This moves us into his breakdown of semantic warfare.
A really crucial part of his argument.
Yeah, Riker claims that language itself is being actively manipulated. For instance, he looks at the phrase toxic masculinity. In his framework, this isn't a valid psychological diagnosis, it's a linguistic bullet aimed directly at the male identity.
Semantic shifts are incredibly powerful tools for narrative control. Riker dissects modern buzzwords like emotional labor and the mental load.
You hear those a lot lately.
You do. In recent years, feminist literature has rebranded basic, functional adulthood, like remembering a relative's birthday, scheduling a doctor's appointment, or writing a grocery list as labor.
Right.
Riker argues this is a strategic move to retroactively charge men with domestic negligence. By elevating domestic trivia to the status of grueling labor, society completely dismisses the highly visible physical burden that men carry by working 60 to 80-hour weeks in demanding jobs to actually finance that household.
And you see this cultural conditioning playing out heavily in pop culture. Riker identifies what he calls the Homer Simpson effect.
The bumbling dad trope.
Exactly. If you look at nearly every sitcom, commercial, or movie over the past 3 decades, just analyze how the father figure is portrayed. He is almost universally depicted as a bumbling, incompetent punchline who can't figure out how to pack a school lunch or operate a washing machine.
While the wife is portrayed as the hyper-competent, razor-sharp hero holding the family together, Riker argues this isn't just lazy comedy, it's intentional propaganda.
And if we connect this to the broader developmental timeline, Riker shows that this conditioning begins long before men reach adulthood or marriage. He examines the modern education system.
Right, arguing that contemporary classrooms are structurally designed around female neurodevelopment. A boy's natural kinetic energy, his competitiveness, his need for physical activity and risk-taking, these are heavily penalized in an environment that demands sitting still in quiet compliance.
Which Riker then connects directly to the explosion of ADHD diagnoses in young boys. He argues we are heavily medicating natural male energy simply because it disrupts a female-optimized environment.
And the result of that.
He points to the massive widening college enrollment gap, where men now make up barely 40% of university students. He presents this as mathematical proof that the system is actively marginalizing boys from an early age.
This brings us back to you, the listener, and how you interact with this information daily. So what does this all mean for the way you consume everyday media?
Riker is essentially challenging you to wake up to the programming. When you mindlessly consume media that reinforces that dumb dad trope or accept the pathologizing of male energy in schools, Riker argues you're validating the exact cultural foundation that will later be used against you in a family court to justify taking your assets and your children.
But Riker's book isn't just a heavy diagnosis of the problem.
Not at all.
The entire latter half of the text is dedicated to rigorous tactical solutions. This is the escape phase. Having identified the legal and cultural traps, he outlines specific protocols for navigating, surviving, and ultimately bypassing what he calls the gynocracy.
This is where the book shifts from critique to an actionable playbook. One of the primary concepts he advocates for is geographic arbitrage coupled with digital nomadism.
Riker's logic here is straightforward. If the laws in your current country are inherently predatory toward men, you must move your capital, your business, and your physical self to jurisdictions that maintain sane, equitable family laws.
And he gets highly specific here. He details the mechanics of jurisdictions like Estonia, Singapore, and the Philippines. For example, he unpacks a case study of a man who successfully relocated his remote tech business to Estonia. What makes a move like that a strategic defense?
The mechanics of it really come down to legal firewalls. Estonia, for instance, has a highly digitized, efficient corporate structure, but more importantly, it does not enforce the same draconian, infinite spousal support laws found in Western family courts.
Interesting.
By establishing your corporate entity and residency in a jurisdiction like that, you are placing your capital behind borders where biased domestic courts cannot easily subpoena or seize it. It's basically international asset protection.
Closer to home, he heavily advocates for the marriage strike and aligns with the philosophy of MGTOW men going their own way. But he goes beyond the philosophy to discuss the execution. Riker suggests that rational, informed men should completely bypass the state-sanctioned marriage contract. Instead, he advises opting for intentional singlehood, or if a partnership is desired, strictly utilizing private, heavily vetted contractual agreements that bypass family court jurisdiction entirely.
And this raises an incredibly important analytical point about Riker's tone and intent. He is adamant that these strategies, MGTOW geographic arbitrage, are not acts of bitterness or defeat.
They're rational, calculated strategic retreats.
Exactly. He compares it to shifting your position on a battlefield. It's about shifting from being a highly vulnerable consumer in a rigged game to becoming a sovereign, untouchable investor. If the architectural design of the system is to extract your resources, the only logical countermeasure is to render those resources invisible and legally inaccessible.
And he details exactly how to make those resources invisible through financial and digital defense. He breaks down the necessity of compartmentalizing your life. We're talking about operating businesses through layered LLCs and utilizing irrevocable trusts. With an irrevocable trust, Riker explains, the assets technically no longer belong to you. They belong to the trust. This creates a massive legal hurdle for any family court attempting to calculate your net worth for division.
He applies that same level of defensive paranoia to the digital realm, too. Riker advises his readers to operate under the assumption that they are constantly under surveillance.
Which means moving all sensitive communications to encrypted applications like Signal.
Exactly, storing critical financial documents or cryptocurrency on physical hardware wallets rather than cloud servers, and intentionally cultivating a parallel digital life. The goal is to ensure that a predatory lawyer cannot cherry-pick or twist your digital footprint into fabricated evidence of emotional abuse or hidden wealth.
So we've covered the tactical retreat and the defense mechanisms, but here's where it gets really interesting. Riker doesn't just advise men to hide in the woods and protect their wallets. He advocates for active, strategic rebuilding. He calls this new infrastructure the Brotherhood.
Yes, and he's very careful to define what the Brotherhood is not. It is absolutely not a therapy group. It is not a forum for men to sit around in circles and complain about their ex-wives.
Good.
Riker defines the Brotherhood as a highly disciplined strategic council. He's calling for men to form tight-knit, real-world alliance networks.
To share actionable legal intelligence.
Yes. To aggressively vet and recommend lawyers who actually have a track record of destroying false allegations, and to pool capital to create financial safety nets for brothers who get blindsided by sudden divorce filings or restraining orders.
To back up the effectiveness of this, he points to mainstream corporate data, citing a Harvard Business Review analysis which demonstrated that all male networking groups massively accelerate career mobility.
Because men in these groups tend to give direct, unfiltered, highly critical advice without worrying about emotional coddling.
Exactly. Riker says men need to harness this exact dynamic for asymmetric warfare.
When Riker speaks of asymmetric warfare, he is talking about economic and technological leverage. He advocates for the collective defunding of hostile, woke corporations that actively push anti-male agendas in their marketing.
Defund them and build your own.
Right. Simultaneously, he calls upon male ingenuity, the same drive that built the internet and the modern grid, to code and construct parallel tech platforms and financial networks that operate entirely outside the reach of gynocentric censorship.
But none of this outward strategy works without internal discipline. Riker spends considerable time establishing that physical and mental mastery is the prerequisite for institutional survival. What does that internal mastery look like in Riker's framework?
It looks like radical self-optimization. He mandates lifting weights and building physical strength. He demands that men abandon modern estrogen-mimicking junk food.
Getting back to basics.
Crucially, he advises cutting off the mainstream media feed entirely, arguing that the 24-hour news cycle is specifically engineered to keep men in a state of paralyzing fear, rage, and low-level depression. Instead, he wants men to adopt a stoic predator's mindset to problems.
And to be clear, he does not mean acting as a predator toward people.
No, no. He means adopting a predatory focus toward challenges. It means acting strategically, observing coldly, and executing a plan, rather than reacting emotionally to provocations.
It's about becoming undeniably competent. When your business fails, you adapt. When the legal system attacks, you fortify your position. Riker's entire operational playbook is designed to allow men to thrive completely outside the traditional state-sanctioned parameters of success.
To distill the core takeaways from our deep dive into this extensive text today, Riker's book presents a heavily documented, fundamentally uncompromising view of a cultural and legal architecture that he argues is explicitly designed to extract male labor, resources, and utility.
But the value of the book, according to the author, lies in its solutions.
Exactly. It offers a rigorous, tactical blueprint for men to reclaim their financial autonomy, to redefine their purpose, and to secure their freedom. It's essentially a guide to shifting your life's operating system from one of compliance to one of absolute sovereignty.
It is an intense, meticulous read that challenges the reader to deeply examine the fine print of the societal contracts we sign every day. And that brings us to a final, lingering question to build on everything we've unpacked today. I want you to really think about this.
Let's hear it.
If a civilization's entire physical infrastructure, its tax base, and its security rely on the relentless physical labor, the quiet sacrifice, and the ongoing compliance of men, what happens to the entire structural integrity of that society when its foundational builders finally decide to go on strike, walk away, and build their own table?
That is a profound systemic question. And considering current demographic shifts and the rise of men opting out of traditional milestones, economic indicators suggest we may soon witness the answer playing out in real time.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into some truly heavy material. Take a second right now to like and subscribe to the show so we can keep bringing you these thorough explorations of complex texts.
And we enthusiastically urge you to go pick up the ebook right now.
Yes, you can purchase Unconscionable Contract, Two-Tier Marriage Trap Misandry under Gynocentrism by Conrad Riker today on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
We also highly recommend that you follow the author's ongoing research and commentary. You can find him writing at Conrad Riker on Substack.
And for maximum engagement with these topics and to see his daily insights, make sure to follow him on Twitter at Conrad Riker and check out his video content on YouTube at Conrad Riker.
It's definitely worth checking out.
Stay curious, think critically about the systems around you, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.